Quick reminder before we get started, if you haven't subscribed or followed this podcast on your favorite podcast platform yet, I would really appreciate it if you click the follow button now or the subscribe button, as it will really help us a lot. In this episode of Recovery Snippets, I interview Jennifer Rollin, who's an amazing eating disorder therapist who also has a lived experience of struggling with orthorexia, the obsession with clean eating, which then turned into anorexia, the obsession with being at a very low body weight and restricting her food intake. Anyway, in this episode of Recovery Snippets, Jennifer talks about the skill called the pause skill. Basically, it's an acronym for how to manage intense urges, like when you get an intense urge to binge eat, to let you know that you're not a slave to your emotions. If you get the urge, that it's not the end of the world. You can ride this wave and you can go through this urge and you don't have to act on it. So let's listen to Jennifer on how we can follow and learn the skill. So you mentioned a while back, whilst I got a chance to speak with an amazing therapist. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. So for people who are currently struggling with binge eating in this podcast, what are some DBT skills that can help people reduce their urges to binge eat?
That's a great question. DBT has a ton of skills that can be useful for people. There's one that talks about different mind states. So wise mind, reasonable mind, and emotion mind, and helping people to make wise-minded decisions, which are usually values aligned, versus when we're feeling triggered to want to binge, often we're in emotion mind. We're caught up in our feelings, right? So helping people to come from more of a wise-minded perspective can be useful. There's another skill I like to use called a behavior chain analysis from DBT. And that's where we think about all our behaviors as really like links in a chain. And at the end of the chain is the binge. And so you start with what happened at the beginning of the day? What time did you wake up? How are you feeling? What did you have for breakfast? And you work your way, because once you figure out which links in the chain led to the binge, you can work on challenging those chain links, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So really exploring the vulnerability factors and what was behind the person starting to binge. I also have a skill that I made up myself called the pause skill, which I can send you the link to put in the show notes from a blog post I wrote. But it's similar to DBT. It's an acronym, and each letter stands for something different that you're supposed to do, which can also be helpful for binge eating, because I find that many of my clients who binge, it can become very automatic to where there's no space between when they feel the urge to binge and when they act on it. And so part of the skills that we're using is helping them learn how to use other skills and put some space between urge and action. So eventually they can make other choices, so they feel more conscious and more able to make informed choices instead of on this like autopilot, just kind of acting on urges, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Is it very similar to urge surfing? The pause skills?
Yeah, it's definitely similar to urge surfing, which we use both for eating disorders as well as for substance use treatment. And part of urge surfing is where research shows that most urges do come down eventually if we're able to sit with them, sometimes in as little as 30 minutes, but sometimes longer. And so if you think of the urge as raising and peaking, and then you act on it, it's like kind of like a bell curve. And so what we want to do is have people learn how to have that urge raise and peak, and then they're able to use other skills, and naturally it will come down on its own, instead of getting caught in that loop of, I feel the urge, I act on it, and so now I'm in this small circle of feeling the urge and acting on it, instead of realizing I can use other skills and tools, and eventually it will come down naturally on its own without me acting on it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because when I struggle with binge eating, once I have even just a tiny bit of an urge, I just think, oh well, that's it. Might as well just do it now. There's no stopping now. And surfing back then would have been really helpful for me.
Yeah, and binging was one of the behaviors that I struggled with as well, and I definitely related to that feeling of almost like an out of body experience of like I felt almost like possessed of like I have no control in this moment. Like I am just acting on these urges with no space in between them.
Yeah, and you don't even enjoy the food. You just like an autopilot. You just like putting it in your mouth mechanically. It just like you're rushing it in. It's not even enjoyable sometimes.
Right. It's usually what I tell people, because this is true. It's usually like maybe 30 seconds of it feels enjoyable, and then you start to feel terrible, both physically and emotionally. Like you feel, why am I doing this again? People often struggle with beating themselves up. You feel like physically really uncomfortable. But it's just one of those behaviors that can be really difficult to stop, especially on your own. And that's why it's so helpful to have like professional support from experts who can help you.